Welcome back, Honors. Welcome back to your Flip Classroom and our continuing discussion of the spread of the Reformation, right? We started talking about the spread of the Reformation from the Holy Roman Empire, which is where Luther is going to start it in 1517. And now we're talking about its spread by 1521 into England, right? We're talking about the growth of the Anglican Church, the Church of England, under the Tudors, particularly that of Henry VIII, and then, of course, all of his wives, right, that he had 6 of in total. And then by the point of this story, right, where we left off in class, we were talking about the Act of Supremacy, which is a law that Henry VIII is going to write that is going to force all the members, all of the people of England to convert to Anglicanism, and it's going to basically all but outlaw Catholicism in general. Oh my God, the burps. Now, where we left off, though, he has 2 surviving children, right? One of them is Mary, who has moved to a nunnery with her mom, Catherine of Aragon. And also we have the other one, who now has a dead mom in the form of Elizabeth I, right? And mom being Anne Boleyn. So the thing that we need to understand, though, as well, is that some of this whole thing is going to cause a lot of political chaos, right? Some of his advisors are going to refuse to take the Act of Supremacy, which will then violate the Act of Treason, which is going to then end up seeing them beheaded as well. Some of those people include people like Sir Thomas More, right? For those of you who actually are really interested into looking into some other stuff. Now, when Anne Boleyn itself also, she refuses to get a divorce. She has violated the Act of Treason. She gets beheaded too. Then he gets married for his 3rd time to the woman that he claims that he loved more than all of them. He claims that he loved Jane Seymour more than any other woman that he ever came into contact with, right? Jane Seymour, though, is also going to bear him a son, right? Jane Seymour, his 3rd wife, will give birth to his surviving son. Now, a lot of people that have not taken a good history course don't realize that he ever had a son, because a lot of textbooks tend to leave him out, and a lot of textbooks tend to not talk about him because he was only really around for a little bit of time, and also because he looked like this, right? His name is Edward, right? He would go on to become Edward VI, right? Now, in this whole process after Edward is born, Henry is going to pass another act, and it's going to be called the Third Secession Act of 1543. You don't need to write that down. Shelby, I'm watching you, okay? You don't need to write that down. But the Third Secession Act of 1543 is going to make it so Henry VIII, one day when he dies, that the order of succession is going to go to his son first, and then to prevent or avoid a civil war from breaking out, like the one that actually put the Tudor family into power. Okay, so there was this really big civil war called the War of the Roses that actually put the Tudor family into power. Did you know that, PP? So, what's going to end up going down, though, is to avoid another civil war like that. This Third Secession Act is actually meant to avoid, large-scale secession crises, okay? So it says that once Edward is done with his reign, or if he actually, whatever happens, that it can then go and pass on to his daughters, right? Now, the interesting thing about this, though, is that nobody expected Mary to be alive, let alone be close or, not, married off to somebody by this point. But what's going to end up going down, though, is Henry does have 3 more wives, right? So he passes that Third Secession Act of 1543. He doesn't die until 1547. I think he does in 1547. But he has 3 more wives in total. One of them he's only married to for, a couple days, right? So her name's Anna Cleves, right? He actually claimed that, it was a big ripoff because there was this other guy named Sir Thomas Cromwell that actually, Sir Thomas Cromwell, who actually showed him a picture of her done by Hans Holbein. You remember when we looked at the ambassadors, right? The one with the cool, creepy skull, the warped skull or whatever? That same artist actually did another painting called The Portrait of Anne of Cleves, and Sir Thomas Cromwell, one of his advisors, one of Henry VIII's advisors, apparently showed this painting to Henry VIII and was like, yo, bro, check it out. Look at this hot German princess that's over there. And then when they met each other, Henry got really embarrassed because he tried to set up this Disney movie moment and it didn't go the way he wanted it to. And then he literally was like, she's ugly and smells weird and I don't like the way she looks, blah, blah, blah. And then she made fun of him and stuff like that. So they didn't last very long. And then another one named Catherine Howard actually is going to cheat on him with one of his courtiers, and then she ends up beheaded. And then Catherine Parr is his last wife, and then she just doesn't die, right? Now, the thing about it that we're looking at is, don't forget that little rhyme, divorced, beheaded, died. Divorced, beheaded, survived, right? Because it will help you actually identify some of the women and some of the actual wives in the matching section of your test, right? Now, going into it, though, something that you need to also understand is that Henry VIII is going to die from an infection from that nasty ulcer we talked about in class, where he got stabbed in the thigh when he was jousting when he was younger and stuff like that. But he dies, and he also dies very, very morbidly, unfortunately overweight, caused by the fact that he couldn't walk around very much on that gross ulcery leg. And the other thing about it, though, is that means that who's going to take over? None other than Edward, right? And Edward would become Edward VI. Now, Edward VI only ruled for about 6 years and didn't do a lot of stuff politically that we're really that worried about. He had this book written called the Book of Common Prayer, which is a pretty big deal. But the other interesting thing about it is he never gets married, and because he's pretty young, right? He's actually about Let me think. He's like 9 when he actually takes the throne. And he dies at the age of 15 from the disease known as tuberculosis, right? Now, the thing about it, though, is when he actually, he dies because he was a pretty sickly kid. I mean, like, look at him, right? Like, he was born very sickly and underweight. And so what ends up going down, though, he actually tried to avoid his, reign or the crown passing to one of his sisters, okay? Now, the interesting little thing that happens to this whole thing is this fails miserably. He tried to pass the throne on to this woman named Lady Jane Grey. Lady Jane Grey was his cousin and one of his best friends. He tries to give the throne over to her, and she's only about 19 years old, or I think 16 or 19 years old. She's very, very young. And then she didn't even want the job. She was like, I don't want this, right? Dude, Edward, I don't want this. I don't want this. You have a sister that this is going to go to. And that sister is very, very famous. And then that sister showed up with an army mad that Lady Jane Grey was about to get the throne. And Lady Jane Grey was only queen for about 9 days, right? And then she has her beheaded, right? So she has this one, or the woman that has her beheaded is none other than Mary, who's still alive, right? And who's 35 years old by this time, and she's mad, right? She's super upset. And so Mary actually becomes queen, has Lady Jane Grey executed after her brother passes away, and then also after, ultimately Lady Jane Grey ends up headless. And so what ends up going down, though, is Mary becomes Mary the First, the very first sole ruler of England as a queen, right? She returns to England, and the thing about it, y'all, she's mad and she's Catholic, right? She actually thinks that the idea of the Anglican Church and the Church of England was a big load of hogwash, and she also hates her dad, right? Hates her dad with a fury because he divorced her mom, and then she is ready to go on a tirade. So she actually brings England back to Catholicism, right? Cancels the Anglican Church and tries to bring everything back into reverse. And she has people burned at the stake who actually refuse to do so, and she actually burned apparently over 300 people at the stake, earning herself a nickname, Bloody Mary. Y'all, yes, the Bloody Mary that you did this whole little thing with when y'all were kids. Light a candle and be like, Bloody Mary. Bloody Mary. And y'all be like, oh, I can't do it. And then you just run away, right? So Bloody Mary was a real person, right? She actually was a real person. She was the very first female queen of England, and also was, some historians consider the very, very first major female monarch in all of European history. Now, major, I mean as in the queen of a very, very large country. Now, the thing about it, though, is a lot of crazy stuff's going to happen in Mary's life, but she actually only rules for about 5 years before she ends up dying. And we'll bring her up again a little bit later on. But that means that the throne's going to pass to her sister Elizabeth. Now, Elizabeth is going to come into power, and she's going to be considered one of the best rulers in English history because she successfully begins to try and split the government and the church. She brings England back to Anglicanism, right? So look at that flip-flop and leapfrogging, right? We got Henry VIII Anglican, Edward VIII Anglican, Mary Catholic, Elizabeth back to Anglican again, right? But what Elizabeth actually successfully does is she brings England back to Catholicism, to Anglicanism, and she tries to split the government from the church, right? She tries to create a church that is much more autonomous on its own, and she becomes what is known as the governor of the church rather than the head of the church, right? So she's like, look, I am no pope. I am no religious leader. I am simply the queen of this country. The archbishops and the bishops of this country have more ability to lead this church than I do, right? And so she's seen as a very, very prominent leader for that. Also, fun fact, she never got married. Actually, she was known as the Virgin Queen, and she would oftentimes use her, unmarried eligibility to actually dictate and, dictate a lot of, politics that were going on around and be like, ooh, maybe I'll marry you if you enter into this trade agreement with me, and then she just never would, right? And the state of Virginia was actually named after her, right? So big thing about it, though, is we're going to leave England off right there. I'm about to clip in another flip real fast, and y'all are going to learn about Calvinism and the Counter-Reformation, right? But I'll see y'all soon. Take religion and the state and separate them, and she's going to be the last ruler of the Tudors, right? And then she will die, and it'll eventually pass to another family, right? But that's a big thing we can review tomorrow morning. Now, look, getting into it, we got one other major reformer that's going to come along that's going to send ripples throughout the rest of European history, and we will end up talking about these people quite a few different times, right? The other major reformer is a man by the name of John Calvin, right? John Calvin is going to show up much later, though, right? So Martin Luther starts his Reformation in 1517 and dies in the 1540s. Well, as in 1530, Henry VIII creates the Church of England. Well, in 1534, a crazy event goes down where John Calvin feels unsafe in his native land of France, right? So really quick to give you a heads up, John Calvin is from France, right? And they're being ruled over by a very Catholic ruler, a guy named Francis I, right? Francis I of the Valois family is extremely Catholic and keeps talking down and keeps preventing the spread of Protestantism in France. And then one night, out of nowhere, there was this event called the affair of the placards, right? And what that means is basically like the event of the placards. Well, what a placard is it's like a poster, right? It's like a poster, you know what I'm talking about? It's a placard, right? So like now, the big thing about it though is what happened was in the affair of the placards, overnight in Paris and also all over France, a series of posters popped up all over the place saying that the Catholic Church was bad, that Protestantism was the way to go, that Francis was the devil, and all this other stuff. One of these posters even popped up on his bedchamber door. Not John Calvin's, but Francis's bedchamber door, which is crazy, which means that they had to get past guards to just stick it on there. Now, the way it goes, though, is that Francis I then begins a campaign of arresting and executing any suspected Protestants. Well, John Calvin, fearing for his life, runs away. He runs away from France and he moves to Switzerland, right, where he actually creates this thing known as Calvinism, right? And in the city of Geneva, Switzerland, he creates his new version of the Protestant faith. The biggest thing that you need to understand about Calvin and Calvinists, though, is one, you've met some Calvinists before, and you don't even realize it. You met them when you were in elementary school. You just don't call them Puritans. You called them Pilgrims. And a lot of you are reading a story or have read a story called The Crucible that has Calvinists in it, right? Puritans are Calvinists and stuff like that. And from what you know already about Puritans and Calvinists and things like that, John Calvin and the faith that he begins and starts up actually is going to have a super strict moral code, an aggressively strict moral code, right? Where they are going to believe and preach this one giant concept known as predestination. Predestination is kind of what Calvinism hinges on. What that is it's the idea that they believe that God knows where you're going to go before you're even born. Whether you will go to hell or go to heaven. Knows your entire life, every mistake, triumph, everything you're going to do because he is an omniscient power and being, right? And they believe that they are the chosen few that will actually ascend into heaven, and predestination is a very aggressive ideology, right? It basically kind of eliminates the concept of free will that Catholics do believe in, right? And so with this predestination idea of God knows what's going to happen to you before you're even born, they also outline a very strict moral code for their societies, right? They're like, we are the chosen Calvinist few that are going to ascend into heaven and things like that. And in their society, a lot of really aggressive things happens with the strict moral code. Write this little list because all these things, if you lived in a Calvinist city, would have been illegal, right? So the following things, if you lived in a Calvinist city, if you were Puritan, if you were in the Crucible, if you were in the Scarlet Letter, if you existed as a Presbyterian, well, not a Presbyterian, Scott still drank, but still, you understand what I'm saying. The big thing about it in general, though, is Calvinists believe that a lot of things in their society should be outlawed. Things like bright-colored clothing, drinking, singing, dancing in public, games for children, decks of cards, the Halloween, like all these things that ever distract, theater, pubs, taverns, like all these different things would have to be outlawed. So basically, no fun. You're just not allowed to have any fun whatsoever in a Calvinist like setting. But what's going to happen also is church attendance is required. You could receive a fine or like an actual like ticket for not going to church in a Calvinist society. And the big thing about it, like I said, is predestination means that God knows what's going to happen to you before you're even born. But what we're trying to get at with this is we're just bringing up Calvinists because we're going to talk about them a lot more later, in later units, right? Because we're going to have massive ripple effects going forward. Now, this part I'm going to move through real quick due to the fact that you've learned about it already in Mr. Mathern's class. The bulk of your Reformation discussion that you had in Mr. Mathern's class really kind of went around this entire concept, right? It focused around the concept of reforming the Catholic Church. Because during the Protestant Reformation, when Luther shows up, when Calvin shows up, when Henry VIII breaks away, as you can see, a lot of crazy stuff is happening. In a few short years, within 20 years of European history, you're going to have 3 brand new types of Christianity pop up, be it Calvinist, or like if you extend it 100 years, it's 4 if you include the Hussites, Calvinist, Church of England or Anglican, and then also the Lutherans, right? So the Catholic Church, under the leadership of a very important person, jot his name down. His name was Pope Paul III by this point, because Leo X had already died. But in this entire process, by this point in history, Pope Paul III looks at the Catholic Church and he's like, you know what, guys? Maybe it's not them. Maybe it's us, right? So, and they decide under Pope Paul III, who's an hilarious guy, by the way. Pope Paul III is the same one that laughed in that cardinal's face whenever Michelangelo painted him in hell, you know what I mean, in the Last Judgment with a snake and all that stuff, right? Pope Paul III led the Counter-Reformation, and he said it is high time that the church look inward and fix itself. And at a giant set of meetings, because it wasn't just one meeting, it was multiple meetings, at this meeting that is actually drawn in this thing right here was known as the Council of Trent. And at the Council of Trent, that I know you learned about in Mr. Mathern's class, because I talked to him about it numerous times, the Council of Trent was a series of meetings that were made to fix Catholicism. What are some things they're going to do, you ask? Oh, that's a great question right there, Megan Wolf. So some big things that come out of the Council of Trent are ones like priest training. They want to try and create a system to train priests in a more effective manner. Make sure they can speak Latin. Make sure they're not mumbling at Mass. Make sure they're not getting into the priesthood so for financial gain, pluralism, simony, or nepotism, right? Another big one is not no indulgences, but they're going to outlaw the sale of indulgences, right? That's going to be a huge thing that comes out of the Council of Trent. Women are going to be brought in to work and help educate people, creating Catholic schools. And another huge one is the Inquisition. Now, I always like to include that one right there, the Inquisition, just to show people the Council of Trent was not perfect, right? The Inquisition was still a court that tried people for heresy and crimes against the church and would sometimes torture and or execute them, right? And that's not a thing that actually is very appropriate. So the Council of Trent wasn't perfect, right? There were still some things that held on in the 1500s, of course, because it was an archaic time period and stuff like that, going back 500 years ago, when things were still not completely right. Also, another big thing they didn't do is they didn't recognize Lutheranism, Calvinism, or the Church of England as legitimate churches, right? So the other thing, though, the last thing that you need to know is also new orders are going to be established, right? And what I mean by orders is I mean orders like these, right? Groups of priests or nuns that will have specific tasks or duties that they want to go out and do, right? And these are guys are coming out of the Council of Trent. One of the most famous groups of nuns that were started after the Council of Trent was a group of nuns who even had a sect of them in New Orleans. A group of nuns that are all about creating schools, healing the sick, and being of community service. And they were called the Ursuline nuns. And those Ursuline nuns created Ursuline Academy, right? So now, they are one of the orders that was established from the Council of Trent. Another famous one, of course, is the Jesuits, right? Why do Jesuit boys act the way that they do, right? Why do they do these things? Why do they wear that uniform? Why do they have to make sure their shoes are tied? Why do their hair can only be a certain length? Did you know Mr. Mathern actually also apparently got in trouble one time for his hair being too long at Jesuit? The big thing about it, why does Mr. Waterston always go like, why aren't your shoes tied? Because Jesuits were started by a monk that came out of the Council of Trent. And his name was St. Ignatius of Loyola. Well, St. Ignatius of Loyola was tasked by the Council of Trent of creating a new sect of monks that actually had a militaristic-like stance on things. Extreme discipline. Why is this? It's because St. Ignatius of Loyola was in the military whenever he began to actually convert to becoming a priest, right? So the thing that ended up happening is he got shot in the leg with a cannonball, and he couldn't get out of his bed. And since he couldn't physically work out, he's like, you know what? I'll mentally work out. And he'd pick up his Bible every single day, and he would do a set of Psalms and basically try to memorize the entire Bible every single day. And he became very closely connected with his faith. And he believed that monks should actually run themselves more like the military, have extreme discipline, be very dedicated to their tasks, and be trying to spread Christianity and education all over the world, right? And they're going to take Christianity and education to new places and new colonies. That's why we have Jesuit high school right here in New Orleans. But that's why those guys have to be so disciplined, because it's what they're all about. It's what they were founded upon. And this right here, it's the last thing, y'all. The biggest thing now is coming out of it is just the religious and social effects of the Reformation, okay? And what they are is pretty quick. Christianity, it's going to spread, right? The new orders like the Ursulines and the Jesuits are going to help spread Christianity to new areas. And also Christianity is going to spread because if you actually know anything about history, in 1492, Columbus is going to run into the Caribbean, and we're going to realize that there are two whole new continents there. So Christianity is going to spread to those people as well. Witchcraft also is going to become a really big issue. Of course, especially in Protestant communities. Well, of course, you know that already from reading the Crucible or reading the Scarlet Letter or actually having a class with the Mr. Troy Roddy, right? And then last but not least, political power and church power are going to begin to become separate, and church power is going to begin to fall off a little bit. But that's it. That's the rest of this unit. 12 minutes. Y'all love it. See y'all soon. Y'all have a good one.